Well, let's return to our top story, and we brought you an investigation into the deaths of 15 paramedics and aid workers killed in Gaza. Joining me for some reaction is Ministry of Foreign Special Affairs Envoy and former Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem, Fleur Hassan-Nahoum. Very good to see you this afternoon. Could I start by asking you what your reaction is to the Sky News investigation?
Well, you know, it's interesting because last year there was a similar Sky News investigation about a mass grave that had been found. And of course, as always, the blame had been put squarely on Israel for killing people and burying them in a mass grave with their hand behind their backs. A few hours and a few days after this special report, it was discovered that, in fact, it was a Hamas mass grave where they'd buried their own people, their own Gazans, they'd murdered point blank. And so what I would say is, that unfortunately mistakes happen in war, especially when you're dealing with an enemy that doesn't do the basic thing in a war, which is put on a uniform and say, I'm a combatant. We know that the Palestinian leadership in Gaza have been using ambulances for decades. The Qassam brigades boast that they even have their own ambulances that they use. So we really hope that it wasn't a mistake, but in the fog of war and with an enemy that makes it into an art form, hiding themselves amongst doctors, civilians, doctors that are Hamas members, it's very difficult to know what is true and what isn't true. But what I can tell you is that the IDF, as the moral army and ethical army that it is doing an internal investigation. And if it was a mistake, they will admit it, as they've admitted before.
Yes, the IDF is conducting its own internal investigation, and as you know. Why is it taking so long? I mean, this attack was on the 23rd of March.
Well, I don't think taking so long. We're in the middle of a war when you're being attacked. We had rocket fire last night. People seem to forget that we're still under attack. We're still in war. When it was in the middle of the night, when there's conflicting reports, when you have dozens of soldiers to interview. I have full trust in the IDF because we have done this before. And when people have made a mistake or are to blame, that has been dealt with. But I can tell you one thing, the IDF will never deliberately kill anybody that is not a combatant, that it does not see as a threat. Like I said, mistakes can be made in war. And unfortunately, that's part of the tragedies of war. But let's not forget the 36 Israeli paramedics were brutally murdered on October 7th, point blank. Some of them even had gloves on their hands as they were treating the injured. Those are the reports that have to come out.
Why was a bulldozer used to bury the ambulances, do you think, if there is nothing to hide?
Again, we don't know what was used. We have eyewitness report, we have people's phones. This is an ongoing investigation. And I do urge you, the same time last year, when you, Sky News, were reporting that there was a mass grave that Israel had dug up, which turned out not to be an Israel mass grave. But then there was no correction in that report, which was so damaging to Israel. Let's wait and see what the report says, shall we?
The IDF account has already changed on discovery of the video footage. You can understand why journalists and indeed all sorts of outlets, organisations around the world would want to interrogate the facts.
We always get interrogated by the facts, and we're a democracy, and this is how we live here in Israel, and we're fine with that. But there's conflicting reports. The investigation is not over. So the IDF has not contradicted itself because it hasn't finished the report. We believe there were 6 terrorists in that ambulance. It would be no surprise. Like I said, it's a method of war, and they've perfected that art. And until we see what actually happened, who reported what and who's to blame, then we really should not be putting out conclusions that have not yet been found.
If it was so obvious that a vehicle in the dark contained Hamas militants, why does it take almost a month to provide evidence that that was who they were?
Again, we're talking about a very complicated terrain of war. These soldiers are under attack. They don't have free hand to go wherever they want because.
But the IDF did admit that none of these people were armed.
It could be that they weren't armed. Again, we're in the middle of an investigation.
Well, the IDF has said that they weren't armed.
It doesn't mean they weren't terrorists if they weren't armed. We don't know that yet. We don't know where this ambulance was going. And we don't know. It could be a terrible blunder. And if it is, and it's a tragedy, then the IDF will admit to it like it has done before.
The Red Crescent wants an independent investigation. Why not?
Well, the Red Crescent, unfortunately, are not independent. They are the ones who've been used by Hamas or have been complicit with Hamas. They've been taking hostages to hospitals. They've been taking terrorists to their place where they want to do the terror. They are not a neutral party. And so you can't really believe anything that they're saying. Remember, Hamas is the organization that has spent the last 20 years building hospitals in order to cover their tunnels, and
Yes,
not the other way around.
But the Red Crescent are not saying that they want to conduct the investigation. They're calling for an independent one.
Well, the IDF has a record of doing investigations that when they have found there is culpability, they have admitted to it and they have punished anybody who was involved in that culpability. So, you know, it's okay to ask for independent outside investigations when you're dealing with a country that is not a democracy and that doesn't have rule of law in place. That's not the case with the state of Israel. And like I said, this is a tried and tested measure by Hamas, by these terrorists. It's very interesting how the terrorists always get the benefit of the doubt, but yet a law-abiding country doesn't get the benefit of the doubt. Let's wait to the end of the investigation, and then we'll see what happened. And again, like I said, if it was a terrible, tragic mistake, like happens in the fog of war, then Israel will be the first to admit that.
Do you have any insight as to when those findings will be released? We were expecting them this week. So far, not yet.
I can't tell you. I don't know how long it will take, but however long it takes, you can trust that it will be a trustworthy investigation that checks everything and that comes up with a conclusion that you can rely on. You know, when UK and the US were fighting with the ISIS forces in Mosul and Raqqa and lots of other places in Syria, there were always tragic accidents involving paramedics, involving misidentification of vehicles. And the reason is the same, that ISIS, like Hamas, use civilian ambulances, use civilian places of worship, schools, hospital, as their method of war. And that's why it's so difficult to make these conclusions so early on.
All right, Fleur Hassan-Nahoum, thank you very much for talking to us on Sky News.
Thank you.